Chapter 3 is called the adjusting process, and it's all about the process that companies go through at the end of a month just to kind of make sure their books are tidy and in good form. And we'll talk about kind of what that means today. And that's where we're going to start, is why adjusting entries exist, why they're a thing, why we're spending so much time on this, and what is essentially the toughest chapter, I believe, in the entire course is right here in Chapter 3. There's two types of adjusting entries. One type of adjusting entries are prepaid entries, and we'll talk about what those are. And then we'll talk about what accrued adjusting entries are as well. But first, let's talk about adjusting entries in general, why they exist, why they're a thing. What we've essentially done so far, with a few exceptions in Chapter 2, is just record entries whenever cash is received or cash is paid. In addition, a lot of companies still do this. They run what's called cash basis accounting. I used to work for a company that was $12 million in sales when I started, and they were cash basis when I started working for them for the most part. So it's very prevalent, and it's prevalent because it's easy. It's easy to just, whenever you cut a check, make an entry. Whenever you receive a check, you make an entry. Unfortunately, that's not how we're going to be doing things in this class. We're going to be following GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, that thing we talked about in Chapter 1. And GAAP requires us to do what's called accrual-based accounting, or adjusting entries. A couple of things that kind of lead to that, and some of these are silly, but I just feel like it's important we talk about them. The first is the time period assumption. Again, this is kind of a silly thing. I kind of equate this in my head to when you're in algebra class and you learn what's called the reflective property or principle, where A equals A. I always thought that was really ridiculous. Why is this even a thing? And it ends up being something you use, but it's still kind of a silly thing. And the time period assumption is the same thing. It was more important hundreds of years ago when calendars were still being used, not all the time. You know, when calendar use is sporadic, the time period assumption is much more important. But of course, in the States, we use a calendar. We identify days and weeks and months. And that's important because our adjusting entries are going to be based on, a lot of them, that month end. Much more important than that, is the revenue recognition principle. If you look in your textbook, there's probably 2 or 3, maybe even 4 pages now on the revenue recognition principle. If you move on to intermediate accounting, you'll need more information about the revenue recognition principle. But for now, in this class, you need to know revenue is recognized when it's earned. Record revenue when it's earned. That's pretty much the revenue recognition principle as far as you're concerned. Record revenue when it's earned. And the matching principle is kind of a sibling to the revenue recognition principle. The matching principle, or the expense recognition principle, tells us record expenses in the same period as their revenues. And so sales commissions, if you have sales commissions, you record those commissions when the sale occurs, not later when it might actually be paid. And again, if you think about every adjusting entry we do in this chapter, it's either a revenue recognition principle adjusting entry or a matching principle adjusting entry. Everything we do falls back on those two principles, really. All right, a little bit of terminology here. The terms prepaid or deferral mean cash first. That's all they mean. That's it. This one's a little less confusing. Accrual is something that maybe you might have some preconceived notions about, but that's all this means. And so whenever there's a cash first transaction, that's a prepaid or a deferral transaction. If we're paying in advance for an expense, that's an asset. We've talked about that a little bit. There have been some worksheets that have included prepaid insurance, which is an asset, and that's an example of a prepaid item, prepaid expense. If we receive money in advance for revenues, we have also talked about this already, that's unearned revenues or deferred revenues. That's a liability, remember? So those are the two primary prepaid categories we're going to see. And how this is going to go from here, basically, is I'm going to go through essentially all the different types of prepaid and prepaid and deferred entries. That's it. I'm going to go through all of them. And so the textbook goes through all of them. I'm going through all of them. And there's only so many. Now, one thing I do want to point out before we get started is if you're still not where you need to be with Chapter 2 journal entries, this chapter is going to be more difficult than it would be if you had that. So I would suggest, even if you're just trying to get through your homework or what have you, do that. Do what you need to do to get what so you don't have anxiety or issues with your homework being delayed. But in terms of preparing for the exam, Chapter 2 before Chapter 3 is super important. The second thing is a lot of these adjusting entries are intuitive to me. They just make sense. Of course, if we pay for 3 years of insurance, we're going to spread it out over the 3 years and not record it all on the first day. That's intuitive to me. There's some rationality to that. But a lot of this isn't going to come maybe as intuitively to you. And so I will have a screen you'll see before the end of the first video, second video, third video, that kind of summarizes everything in one spot that I think will be helpful to you. All right, let's talk about prepaid insurance. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring up a situation. And typically in class, what I do is I'll say, imagine you're in a business and you purchased a 2-year policy for $4,800. What's the journal entry for that? And I do think it's a very important, helpful exercise for a student to try to write what the journal entry is. But you're in your office, you're at your house. I'm not going to be standing there causing the time delay necessary to do that. And so if you want to do this, just hit pause, write down the journal entry, and then keep going. I'm not going to create a big long pause as I do. Like in class, literally, I do this, and then I sit there for 30 seconds sometimes and wait for everyone to write, just so they write something down or at least look busy. I'm not going to do that on this video. I'm going to go pretty quickly, but if you want to participate in that, just hit pause. Write down the journal entry you think, and then I'll show it to you. And so so here we have an initial entry, a 2-year policy for $4,800, and here's our journal entry for that. Debit to prepaid insurance, credit to cash. Again, these first prepaid items, you're going to see cash first, right? That's the definition of prepaid, cash first. And so our initial entry for all these is going to have cash in it somewhere. So these should be a little bit easier if you're still kind of with journal entries. It should be easier because cash, hopefully you've got that part down. Now what happens afterwards? The adjusting entry for this is going to be every month. Every month we're going to record something. So give a shot for what you think the adjusting entry is for that. And here it is. It's a debit to insurance expense for $200 and a credit to prepaid insurance for $200. Where did the $200 come from? Well, I just took the $4,800, divided it by 2 to get a yearly amount of $2,400, divided that by 12 to get a monthly amount of $200. And that's the math in this class. You know, again, I've said this before, but a lot of students are worried about the math in accounting. And the math, this is the math. That's it. I mean, a little bit, slightly more difficult than this as we progress through, but really not that hard, in my opinion. All right, rent is going to look very similar. Our first entry is you pay in advance for 3 months of rent. You pay in advance for 3 months of rent. Here's our journal entry. Debit to prepaid rent, $3,000. Credit to cash, $3,000. Again, we're paying, so cash goes out, cash goes down. That's a credit. We're debiting prepaid rent because that's an asset that's increased. And then every month we're going to make an adjusting entry. And again, this should feel a lot like what we just did because it's very similar. Every month, we're going to make this entry. $3,000 was for 3 months. And so for each month, we're going to debit rent expense $1,000 and credit prepaid rent $1,000. We create this prepaid rent asset, and then every month it starts to go away. And after 3 months, it's gone. Take a break. We're going to come back and do a couple more prepaid adjusting entries, and then we'll have a worksheet for you to do then as well.